Ask the Pastor question today is, what is your opinion on birth control? And well, my opinion on birth control is that when you're dealing with very serious questions like this, you should probably start with some stupid memes. Therefore. Okay, let's show a couple of funny memes here. We have 5 of them. Go ahead. All right. What are you using for birth control? My husband wears these new fanny pack sandals. In case you're wondering, those are real things. I had to look it up. I'm like, that can't be real. Oh, they're real. They're sandals with a fanny pack in them. They look awful. Give me some for Christmas next year. No. All right, next up. Yeah. The most effective birth control method known to man, 25 cents. Okay, number 3 here. Doctor, are you using any other birth control besides your horrible personality? Like that one. Okay, number 4. This is the effectiveness of different birth control methods. I'll just let you look and think about that. The socks with sandals. That's the key. You want to keep the ladies away. All right, last one. This is my favorite one. Is against meat because animals are fed unnatural hormones. Takes artificial hormones every day to avoid pregnancy. It's like, really? Yeah, that's how people think. You know, I don't want the hormones in the meat, but stick them in my body because I can't have a baby. Don't want that. All right. I don't know who asked. Is the person who asked this question here? Does anybody know who asked this question?
Does anybody want to admit it?
Does anybody want to admit it? So when I first decided I was going to talk about this question today, I thought, all right, that doesn't seem like there's a lot to it. I know what I believe, and I can say what I believe. And then I can tackle 2 or 3 other questions. And then as I started going through it, I realized, wow, there's a lot to this question, and it'd be kind of fun to tackle some of the angles of that. And I thought, okay, so I'm not going to do that and 2 or 3 others. I'm going to just do that question today. But then as I started going through it and compiling my thoughts, I realized, no, this is going to actually be a 2-parter, which, yeah, may surprise you, but I'm going to talk about a lot of different things related to this topic, a few things related to this topic. This will be the first 2-part Ask the Pastor question in this current series, iteration of Ask the Pastor. But there's just a lot of layers to this question, much like ogres and parfaits, or onions. So for some of you, this question may not be super practical. Some of you, like, I don't know, my son Paul might be like, what is birth control? I don't even know what we're talking about today. Some of you are like, well, I'm done having babies. You know, maybe that would have been nice to learn about 20 years ago, but I'm good now. Others of you are like, well, I'm not married, not planning on being married for a while, so not practical today, but maybe someday it will be. But I think for all of us, you know, it's important wherever you're at. So this is a question that's in culture, and this is a question that people have. What is birth control? And there's a lot of different opinions about it, and so it's important for us as Christians to know what is a biblical stance on birth control, and not just, well, this is what the pastor said, and that's why, and I just believe it, I don't know why, but that we really understand this is God's heart. And then when you're communicating to someone in the culture who is coming from a different perspective, you can actually give a convincing reason why the Bible's answer actually makes sense. It isn't just a rule that you got to follow. And ultimately, you have to know what you believe about this because it's an issue. And if you're like, well, I don't know and I don't really care, it's not. Well, the Bible should impact every area of our life, and God's opinion on things should be. We should want His opinion on everything, I think. And so whether you're thinking about having babies or not having babies, or it's just far in the past or maybe far off in the future. I think this is something that hopefully, in the process of answering this, you grab a hold of God's heart, not just about should I use birth control or not, but His heart toward people and families and children. So there's a lot of layers to this, and it's going to take me 2 weeks, I think, to get through this stuff. Hopefully you won't be bored. I know in going through it, I was like, wow, I learned a lot, and I discovered I mean, I hadn't really thought through this other than, well, you guys know we have 7 kids, and Jesse and I have been like, well, I'm not really into birth control. We like big families, so okay, we had peace in our hearts. Bible seems to encourage big families. Let's have big families, and then I don't have to go into it. Well, I learned there's so many different methods of birth control that I never even knew existed, and there's so many different opinions on this whole topic. So just to give you an idea of the whole spectrum of opinions on birth control, before going into what I think. So you have on the one extreme is that all forms of birth control are always bad. So here's a quote from a 4th century Christian leader, John Chrysostom. This is actually pretty good. Why do you sow where the field is eager to destroy the fruit, where there are medicines of sterility, where there is murder before birth? And then he comments on practice that was common in the time of people that would use birth control basically as a tool to be able to fool around and remove, and have no evidence that they were sinning. And he says, you do not even let a harlot remain only a harlot, but you make her a murderess as well. Do you see that from drunkenness comes fornication, from fornication adultery, and from adultery murder? Indeed, it is something worse than murder, and I do not know what to call it, for she does not kill what is formed, but prevents its formation. That's pretty interesting, that from his perspective, as an early Christian, he's like, it's worse than murder because you're not killing what's there. You're not even allowing it to come into formation and then kill it. Okay. What then? Do you condemn the gift of God and fight with his laws? What is a curse? Do you seek as though it were a blessing? Do you make the anteroom of birth the anteroom of slaughter? It's like, okay, that's one opinion. And before I go any further, just disclaimer, wherever you've been, whatever you've done, wherever you're at, I'm not condemning you, I'm not judging you, and as I share some different opinions, that's not necessarily even what I think, and it may not necessarily be what the Bible teaches, or where I think you should be at. So don't, if you hear something and you're like, well, I don't believe that, well, maybe I don't either, but we'll get to that. All right, another opinion on the spectrum. Some forms are bad. John Piper and those in his camp, and many other evangelicals as well, they say that they tend to believe that birth control is fine. It can be a positive thing as long as it's not a type that kills the baby, a non-abortive type of birth control. Another opinion is that birth control is neutral and becomes bad or good depending on your motives. Steve Gregg, a teacher who I really like, he says about birth control, one of the things he says is, the question is not, is birth control sin? The Bible nowhere says that birth control is sin. The question is, why are you looking into birth control? What is your motivation? Matt Perman of Desiring God says, any attitude which fails to see that children are a gift from God, a good gift from the Lord, is wrong. That it's about your motive, your attitude, more than the actions. So that's one opinion. Another opinion on the topic is essentially birth control is neither good nor bad, but just something you and your spouse can decide on. It's a business decision, none business decision. Another opinion, and we're going from one extreme to the other. Birth control is good if you feel you need it. If you have a health issue, if you don't have the finances, if you look at your life and you're like, I just don't think we can handle any kids, or I can't handle more kids, then it can be a good thing. And the final opinion on the spectrum that I'll share is birth control is always good, and not using it is bad and selfish. There are people of the opinion that the world is overpopulated and the climate change is heating up the planet, and we're limited on resources, and so therefore to bring a child into the world, to doom it to die, would be bad for the child, bad for humanity, and bad for the planet. So it's selfish of you to have children, and you should not have children. That's the good thing to do. It's like, wow, okay, so there is a whole spectrum of opinions on birth control from one extreme to the other. So where does the Bible land in that? Where do I land in that? That's the question. So what's my opinion? Glad you asked. Before sharing, I'm going to share just briefly what my opinion is in a little bit. But before sharing into it, I want to give you some initial considerations in the question, and then I'll look at, there's 2 verses that people have used to, so the Bible, I don't believe the Bible directly gives a strong answer, clear answer on this question, but there are some people who have 2 verses or 2 scripture sections that they'll take out and they'll say that they feel like, don't go there yet. Don't go there, Isaac! Thank you. All right, there's 2 verses that some people say these are showing that are dealing clearly with not abortion, birth control. So we'll look at those verses, and then we're going to look into some of the history of birth control and Christians' views on it. Then finally I'll share a quick version of what I think, and then we'll look at actually some biblical foundations. So when I first got this question, I said, okay, I want to think through, since the Bible there's no verse that says birth control is bad or birth control is good. There's no like super clear verse on it. Then my brain goes, okay, well, what is God's heart? To find God's heart, you got to look at the big theme of scriptures and pull different things out to find what is his heart toward this, and then you can apply his heart toward that specific thing. And so then finally we're going to look at some of the foundational stuff there and God's that reveal God's heart toward not just the topic of birth control, but family, life, children, all that whole thing. And then finally wrap up by making a case for big families, because I love big families. We've got 3 good big-sized families here and some medium-sized families, and I think big families are awesome, and I won't tell you how many kids you have to have, and God nowhere in the scriptures says how many kids you have to have, but I will try to do my best anytime you ask me to convince you to have a lot of kids. Get married and have a lot of kids. You got to get married thing first. Yeah, don't just go around, sweet, fill the world with kids. Get a husband or wife first. Figure that out, then have some kids and raise them right. I love having a big family. So we're going to close with that, but we're not going to get to the case for big families till next week. So that is why it's going to take me 2 weeks to go through this stuff. And so maybe some of you are like, why are we going to talk about all that? Well, because I am on stage and you're not. That really is that. Okay. So just some initial considerations as we look at this question. And like anything, I tend to take questions like this where there's multiple different opinions on it, and I kind of like treat it like I come with my lawyer brain, or the aerospace engineering brain. That's what I went to school for originally. And I go, okay, how do I cover my bases? Because everything I say can and will be used against me. So these are some of that, where some foundational initial considerations in answering what is my opinion on birth control. Well, the first thing is, I mentioned this already, the Bible doesn't clearly condemn or condone birth control. There's no, that I could find, and maybe you can find some and enlighten me, but I could not find any clear verses that said one way or the other that it's sin or it's not sin. The interesting thing is, when you look at the historical record, birth control was known by people. We have evidence of people using and talking about birth control during the time that the Bible was written, during the time of the Hebrews and the early church. There's extra biblical evidence that they knew about it, and they used certain birth control methods. So it was used, it was known and it was used, but the Bible's pretty quiet about it. So it's interesting then that it doesn't say, there's not a clear teaching on it for something that was probably known, which leads me to believe it's probably something that God leaves it open to different opinions on it. Now, like I mentioned before, there are 2 verses that people do use to say that this is God's heart on birth control. The interesting thing with the 2 verses is they both are leaning in opposite directions. And it's not clear that that's actually, I don't think it's not God making a definitive statement on birth control, but both of the verses used are leaning in opposite ways. So again, back to my initial consideration here, the Bible is not necessarily super clear one way or the other with it. Secondly, without faith, it is impossible to please God. Hebrews 11:6 says that. Whatever you do, you've got to do it in faith. You started your car this morning and came to church. I hope you came in faith, that you weren't like, oh, we're going to die. It's too cold. The snow is everywhere. We're dying. No, I hope you came in faith, saying, Lord, you keep me on the road, keep my car going. Thank you that I get to worship you and praise you and gather together at church. This is awesome. Everything we do, we should do it in faith. So that includes in your family as well. And when you talk about having children and birth control or no birth control, whatever you do, you have to have faith. If you're approaching starting a family, as you and your spouse get together and you're like, they want to have kids, and you're like, no, I'm just worried. I'm going to be a bad parent. I don't know what I'm doing. We don't have the money. We don't have the space. And okay, and then you go, so we can't have kids. We got to use birth control. There's a problem there. The problem is you're coming to your solution based out of fear, not faith. So deal with that, whatever you're doing. You got to start with faith. Now, there's the other side of it, and we met people in Romania. There's a group of Christians, the Pentecostal Christians in Romania, the old school ones, would teach that that if you don't have a large family, you're probably not going to go to heaven. And so you got to have as many kids as you can to make sure you're going to heaven. And so their answer to what should we do with our family? Should we use birth control? They go, well, if we don't use birth control, or if we use birth control, we're going to go to hell. And so therefore, we can't use birth control to make sure that we can go to heaven then. Well, now they're coming to a different answer, but it's also coming out of fear instead of faith. So whatever the Bible teaches on this, and whatever you come to, you and your spouse together, whatever solution you come to, you've got to have faith in the process. If you don't have faith, and if you're coming to an answer and you're like, and you realize the reason we're here is because I'm scared of having kids, I'm scared of we don't have room for that, I don't have enough money, okay, deal with that. Repent of the lack of faith, repent of the fear, repent of the doubt, the worry, and now you can maybe actually hear God's voice on it. And He may say, okay, yeah, your answer is right. Or He may say, yeah, now that you've got faith, do this instead. When Jesse and I, with 7 kids, there were times where we were worried, like, how are we going to pay for all this? Or how are we going to fit this other kid in there? And then you discover bunk beds, and then triple bunks and quadruple. No, we never went triple. We thought about it, and we're like, how many can we pay? But like, God makes a way, So whatever answer you come to, it's got to be based in faith. Number 3, we are called to be a wise steward of God's blessings. God wants to bless you a zillion different ways. He wants to bless you with kids, money, good jobs, friends, family, a good church, a place to work, a good job, etc. Right? Material goods, peace, joy, emotional, spiritual blessings. He wants to bless the heck out of you in every way that He can. But the cool thing with God is He doesn't just come and control you and go, you're blessed, bam, blast you with blessings. He allows you to be a part of that, in 2 different ways. He allows, if He wants to bless you, like for instance, let's say He wants to bless you with money, okay? Well, He's going to allow you to work with Him, to work hard and actually get money, save your money, spend your money wisely, invest your money wisely, be generous with it, follow the guidelines of the Scriptures so that He can bless you more. You get to be a part of receiving the blessing of God. And then the second part of it, when He gives you the blessing, you are accountable to steward that well. I was thinking about this sort of stupid situation, but I've seen it happen to people. So God wants to bless you with health, right? So on the one side, you can't just go eat potato chips and watch TV all day and go, God, why do I have diabetes? Bless me, Lord. You're shoving the donuts in. It's like, okay, He wants to give you health, but you got to leave the donuts aside, and you might have to exercise a little bit. So you work with Him to get the blessing, but now that you got the blessing, you have to steward the blessing well. You got to keep eating healthy, and you have to use the blessing of good health for His kingdom now. I know someone, Jesse and I know someone, I think Michael and Annie and Brian and Kathy might as well, who she was in our church years ago, and she was praying for good health, and God really convicted her. You got to eat better. You got to exercise, and she did, and she started looking really good. She went from rough to like, wow, you look nice now. Now she just posts pictures on Instagram and Facebook, like, look at me, aren't I hot? Aren't I sexy? Don't you want me? It's like, well, wait a minute, you're not stewarding the blessing of God there. you prayed for his blessing, you worked for his blessing, you got his blessing, and now you're being a fool about it. You're not stewarding it well. You're using it for sinful purposes. Or guys that they work out, they get some muscles, and they're like, "Nah, I want to show the chicks my muscles." It's like, no, okay, that's not good. So what about children? Well, I think. Some people say, okay, so because we're called to steward the blessings of God and we work in partnership with God to get his blessings, he allows you to decide how many kids do I think I can handle, and then he says, okay, you say what you want, and then you can have that. And that's all the opinion God shares on the matter, but you get to decide it all. And how you decide how many you have, you look at, well, how good of a parent will I be? How much money do I have? How much space do I have in my house? And then you go, okay, based on that calculation, I will have 3 kids, or I will have 6 kids, or whatever. But that God allows you, as the steward of this blessing, to figure it out on your own. Some people say that, and I heard an African farmer, I read an article that he had written about this whole topic, and he said, you look at Genesis 1, 26 to 28, the initial mandate from God to be fruitful and multiply, to Adam and Eve, to fill the earth with kids. Well, in that mandate, he tells them, make a lot of kids who have kids who have kids. That's part of it. And then the other part, he says, fill the earth, subdue it, and have dominion over it. And so this farmer, he said, look, when I go and farm a field, I don't say, I'm going to farm, the whole land of Zambia. I can't handle the whole land of Zambia. I take a plot, I figure out how much seed do I have, how much can I work, how much am I willing to invest in this? And then I figure out, okay, it's this land, and I farm that land, and I farm it well, because I can't handle more than that. And he said, so then his opinion was, look, if God told them to subdue the land with an expectation that they would be wise about it and not try to just throw seed all over the planet, and look at my farm, it's the earth. But that Adam and Eve would go, okay, this is what we can handle. Then therefore God would expect the same with your kids. Well, there are people with that opinion, and maybe that's what God, maybe that's God's heart. But to push back on that a little, do we treat any other of God's blessings that way? If we really do believe that children are a blessing, well, okay. And you say, well, you should, steward that well and limit it because you may not be able to handle so many kids. Well, what about the blessing of health? Do we say, look, you should limit the blessing of health that God gives you. Just get a little bit of health. You don't want to be too healthy because, you might start flexing in front of the girls and try to pick up chicks, and you never know. Like, you don't want too much health then. You don't want to have too many muscles. No, what we would say is get as healthy as you can. Don't be an idiot. Don't be weird. Don't go on Facebook trying to taking pictures of yourself in bikinis trying to get everybody's attention. Be healthy. Great. Get the blessing of God. Just steward it well. Don't be a fool about it. Money, same thing. We don't tell people, like if someone's like, well, if I get too much money, I'm not going to pray for too much money because then if I get too much money, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to blow it all on cocaine and prostitutes, and I'm going to leave it at the White House. No, if someone's got that attitude, like, well, I don't want too much money because I'm going to use it on drugs, and I'm going to go get drunk, and I'm going to do something stupid with that. How about you get the blessing of money and you decide not to be stupid with it? Like that, we don't treat any other of God's blessings that way. We understand that you're supposed to steward it well, and that doesn't mean limit his blessings. It means use it wisely. Kevin DeYoung, he wrote an article called "The Case for Kids" back in October 20th of 2022. He says in there, I really liked what he said here. I do not urge Christian couples to have as many children as possible, but I do urge them to have more children. How many more? I cannot say. Many couples must weigh risks pertaining to age, illness, miscarriage, or difficult pregnancies. But more than 2 kids and more kids than you think you can handle might be a good place to start. I like that. I'm not going to tell you have to have X number of kids, but you probably should have more kids than you have. Well, get married first, probably should have get more kids than you have, and more than 2 is probably good. But I personally will try to encourage you to have a big family. But you got to figure that out with your spouse, what big means. Number 4, last of the initial considerations that I'll share, you must obey your conscience. Ultimately, the couple has to prayerfully go before God and figure out, Lord, how do you want us to handle this? How do you want us to approach birth control? Look at the scriptures, hopefully hear what I'm saying about it, talk to other people, pray about it, and figure out what are we doing. Because ultimately, you stand before God on behalf of your life. I don't have authority over you. God will not judge me one day and say, you allowed them to have, they only had 4 kids in your church. I wanted them to have 8 kids. Why didn't you? No, that's between you and God. That's, my job and Brian's job as the pastors of the church, the elders of the church. Our job is to teach the full counsel of God, but then you got to take it and you got to run with it. You got to listen to the Holy Spirit and you got to go forward in what He says. So ultimately, you're accountable before God, and you got to obey your conscience in that. Romans 14:4 says, "Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand." I will do all I can to encourage people, families, to have a lot of kids because I think it's awesome. But ultimately, I'm not in charge of your life. And if a couple prays about it and they look at it and they're like, we just are in a place where that doesn't make sense for us, we can't do it. Okay, you're standing before God. You're accountable to God on that part, not me. So that's the final initial consideration. You got to obey your conscience on it. And I say this because there's been, I've known people, and sometimes I think even me and Jesse were those people that we looked at a lot of big families and we're like, oh man, if we don't have enough kids, we're not gonna match up with them and we're gonna be less somehow. No, we're accountable before God to follow what God says. You're accountable to follow what God says. What the Spirit is leading you to do. You stand before Him alone. I'm not going to be judged for you. You're not going to be judged for me. You stand before God to do what He says to do. Jesse and I, we did have those thoughts at times like, man, I don't know, are people going to judge us if we don't do that? And ultimately we're like, well, we want to have a lot of kids. And I don't care if people judge us or if they don't judge us. We're having a lot of kids. And that's what we're doing. And we've had people judge us on both ends. I've had people say things like, boy, you have a big family. You know what makes those kids, right? I'm like, yeah, no, I know. Yeah, stupid comments. Or, oh, here's another big white homeschool van. Like, well, yep, that is. That's who we are. You get judged on either end of it, and some people go, well, what's your problem? How come you haven't? We had a string of girls first, and how come you haven't got any boys there? Is something wrong with you? No, we're just trusting God. But ultimately, you stand before God to do what the Scriptures say and to follow how the Spirit is leading you to follow the Scriptures. Okay. One article I read, actually a few articles that I was reading this last week, and I read way too much on this whole topic. But I learned a lot, and hopefully can give it to you. So some of the articles I read, they basically took this stance of, they said, look, birth control was not something, it's a modern phenomenon that didn't exist during the time of the Bible, therefore the Bible doesn't mention it, it's silent about it, and you can make your own decisions then as a couple. This is half true. The Bible, like I mentioned, does not directly deal with the question of birth control, but it does bring up birth control at least twice in 2 different sections of Scripture, and it does give a framework to understand the question of birth control. And then secondly, modern birth control methods are modern, but birth control has existed since the beginning of birth. Ever since babies were being born, parents were trying to figure out, how do we control this? How do we make this better for us? Whether good reasons or bad motives. Since the beginning, there's been birth control methods. So does the Bible talk about birth control? Well, so there's 2 instances. Number 1 is the sin of Onan. Genesis 38, verses 1 through 10. Raise your hand if you've heard of this, the sin of Onan. So I'm not going to go into all the details of what happened here, but essentially Onan had a brother named and died without having kids. Was married, and then he died without having kids. And so then Onan's father, Judah, asked Onan to practice something that was called Levirate marriage. which was practiced by the Hebrews at that time and other tribes as well, where basically if a man died while he was married, before he had any kids, then one of his brothers would be obligated to sleep with his wife and bear children for his the lineage of his brother who passed away. So the Hebrews practiced that at the time. And so Judah, after died, Judah went to Onan and said, Onan, you got to go provide heirs for your dead brother and get with your sister-in-law and give him some heirs. Well, Onan didn't want to do that, so he slept with his sister-in-law, but refused to get her pregnant. And so then God killed him. So some people take this and they say, okay, so he practiced a birth control method. He had sex without bearing a child, without her getting pregnant. And he did it intentionally to not have a child. So therefore, that's a birth control method. And as a result, God killed him for that. And so some people take that and they say, therefore, that's God's heart on birth control, that all birth control is bad because look what he did to Onan. Onan practiced birth control. God killed Onan. Now, I don't think that this is proof that all birth control is always bad. In context, the issue seems to be Onan's attitude, his motive on why he was doing this. For starters, he was completely rebellious and dishonoring toward his father and toward the culture of their community in refusing to do this. He was disrespectful toward his brother's heritage, uncaring toward his sister-in-law. A woman at that time who had no children would basically be forced to, she would have to be taken care of by her father, and hopefully the father would be good, and when the father died, she'd just be on her own. There'd be nobody to take care of her. It's not like she could just go and start working like nowadays. Back at that time, she needed heirs. She needed kids to take care of her as she grew older. So he's uncaring toward his sister-in-law, and then he ultimately had a selfish attitude toward her to use her for his own pleasure and not allow her the chance of having heirs to take care of her, kids to take care of her. And so I think in context, it seems like here the issue that God had was his attitude, his motive, not the actual act. All right, the second verse that deals with birth control, but that verse, the sin of Onan, it does lean toward birth control not good. So the second verse dealing with birth control is 1 Corinthians 7:5. It's talking about abstinence in marriage. As far as I could find, this is the only other Bible verse that deals with the topic of birth control in any way directly. So Paul, he's talking about married couples, and he's encouraging them, hey, you're married, have fun, be physically intimate, because that's kind of why you're married. Husband's body is for his wife, the wife's body is for her husband, so you should get together, have physical intimacy. But then he makes this little side note, but, while that's the general case, if prayerfully you guys decide, hey, we want to take a season to really focus on God, then go ahead, abstain for a season. But then he says, but don't do it too long, because then the devil can come in with temptations, because you are married and that's a part of marriage, that you should be physically intimate together. But he does allow them. He says, look, if you want to abstain for a period, you can abstain for a period. But in context, I don't really think this is dealing with, the focus is not birth control. The focus is on prayer for a season. And the general thrust of the context is saying, hey, married couples, you should be getting together. You should be physically intimate, which leads to children. But again, the main issue here is what comes down to the motive. Why are they abstaining? Not because they're looking at it going, we don't want to have kids. We can't afford kids. Kids are a nuisance. Man, kids cramp my style. I don't know how to be a parent. That's not their motive. Their motive is, let's take a little time because we want to focus on God. We want to seek God. And so maybe you go off in some tent out in the wilderness. I stay at home, and we're going to fast and pray and seek God. Okay, that's different. In that situation where your heart is you're seeking God for a period of time, all right, well then you're going to have to abstain because you don't want the distractions. So I don't really think that's dealing with birth control itself. But in that context, again, it is dealing with. It comes back to the heart and the motivation. So All right, the other thing I mentioned is, so a lot of the articles, they take this stance that birth control is a modern thing, but it's not a modern thing. We've had birth control throughout history, and the church, Christians, believers, have had to figure out, what do we deal with this? And there's been a lot of different opinions throughout history. So Christine E. Gudorf, I read an essay by her called Contraception and Abortion in Roman Catholicism, and she went through a lot of the history of birth control, and she breaks it down to there's basically 3 forms of birth control that you see throughout history. Number 1, infanticide. The baby's born, you kill it. That's the most brutal form of birth control. Number 2 is abortion. The baby's not born, you kill it. And number 3 is various contraceptive methods to stop a pregnancy from happening, stopping conception from happening. All 3 of these forms, infanticide, abortion, and contraception, were used throughout all of human recorded history as far as we can see. But the most common form, let me ask you guys actually, what do you think the most common form was? Infanticide, which is awful and horrifying, but that was the most common, infanticide. The second most common, abortion, and contraception has been the least common, which really shows you the heart of people, like just evil. Lisa McLean, professor of history and gender studies at Boise State University, she wrote an article about detailing different historical evidence that we have of birth control methods, even contraceptive birth control methods being done in Egyptian cultures way back thousands of years BC, in the Hebrew cultures in the Old Testament, Greek and Roman texts that refer to birth control and different contraceptive methods. Some really unusual ones, like using crocodile dung, dates, and honey. I don't know what they did with it, but okay. So it's been around forever. And the church, Christians, have had to figure out, what do we do with this? So the early church, after Jesus died and rose again, and the early church was launched, the early church almost universally condemned every form of birth control. Obviously, infanticide and abortion were no-goes. And the church made a huge difference in the Roman Empire in having a real strong stance against abortion and infanticide. They rescued probably thousands of babies and raised them to live for God. Which is, you can read up on the history of it. It's incredible. These people that they would go out, the Romans would throw their babies into sewers a lot of times after they were born because they just didn't want them. And underneath the city of Rome in Italy, archaeologists were excavating and they found baby carcasses clogging the sewers of ancient Rome. That's just how heartless and careless they were. According to Roman law, a baby wasn't even fully a baby until 8 days old. Up until 8 days, you could do whatever you wanted with a baby. And so the church said, no, this is not cool. They spoke against it. They taught against it. And then they started going out into the sewers and grabbing the babies that people had thrown away, which is just really cool to think about, very heroic. So the church universally condemned infanticide and abortion. And then also the early church had a strong stance against any sort of other birth control method as well. And part of the reason was biblical, but also a part was cultural, responding to certain things in the Greco-Roman world at the time. Three big things: heretics, prostitutes, and witches. Oh my, yeah. So heretics, there were a number of early Christian heresies that encouraged birth control and contraception. And so the early church, in response to that, then said, no, we're going to be different. We're not doing that. And John Chrysostom, who I read earlier, he and others spoke again about, so there was, at the time, there were a lot of Christians, people getting involved in the church that would use birth control methods outside of abortion and infanticide in order to get away with sinful lifestyles, get away with it, to leave no physical evidence, but God knows what you've been doing. So three main things that the early church dealt with was that people would go and they'd fool around and they'd take birth control so they could fool around and not get someone pregnant, just like nowadays people do that. Secondly, so they could engage in prostitution and not worry about it. And third, to commit adultery. And so then the early church, in response to this, realized there's this connection. People are using birth control. Besides having a biblical framework for it, they realized people are using birth control to fool around, to go to prostitutes, and to commit adultery. So we're going to condemn all forms of birth control because they're using it for these bad purposes. And then thirdly, witches. This one is one I had no idea about as I was researching this topic, but apparently during the early years of the early church and leading up also into the Middle Ages, witches, so if you wanted birth control, you would generally have to go to a witch to go get birth control elements. They would make potions, make drinks and different powders that you could go to the witch and get this and sprinkle it in somebody's food to make them sterile, to make them lose their baby, have a miscarriage, to make the man have problems. I don't know how effective these things were, and I don't know what the exact recipes were, but you would go to the witch to get these things and give them to somebody as a curse that you didn't want to bear children. Also, then, people started going to the witches to get this for themselves because they wanted to be able to fool around and not have kids. And so then the church, seeing that people were going to witches and doing witchcraft in order to not have babies, they said, not cool. We're not into witchcraft, so no birth control. And so there, between the witches, the heretics, and the prostitutes, and a biblical framework, then the early church almost, as far as I could find, almost universally condemned every form of birth control. And as the church grew, so that was the church's mentality, and then as the church grew and expanded, it had a massive impact on the Greco-Roman world. Infanticide just basically was almost entirely disappeared as the church expanded. Abortion almost entirely disappeared, and then birth control was used a lot less, and bigger families became more popular. And in place of infanticide and abortion and birth control, contraceptives, people started practicing abandonment. And abandonment sounds bad, and there's two different forms that they practiced during the Roman years and leading up into the Middle Ages. There were two forms of abandonment that they practiced. One was bad and one was good. The bad one, some people said, well, okay, we get it, infanticide is bad, so we're not going to outright kill our baby, and we get it that abortion is bad, so we're not going to do that. But we're going to abandon our baby by putting it in God's hands in the woods. Your baby's going to die, and you know it. But they would talk themselves, deceive themselves to murder the baby by just abandoning it. So that also the church condemned that, but Christians, so-called Christians, went and did that. Churchgoers were doing it, not as often as the pagans in the Greco-Roman times, but some did it. The other form of abandonment, and this I think the Bible has less of a problem with, if a woman got pregnant and then the baby was born and they realized we can't take care of this baby, they would go to the market or go to some big crossroads or go to somebody's house and just leave the baby there, like you see in those, Charles Dickens. I don't know I didn't read anything by Charles Dickens, but you see in movies, they put the baby in a basket, they leave it somewhere. Well, that started to be practiced in the early church and then into the Middle Ages. And that one actually was used more often than the other type of abandonment. And by the 700s, there's evidence that whole churches had really grabbed a hold of this and said, let's provide a way, let's get the news out that if a woman needs to abandon her baby, we're here. Bring the baby here and we'll find a home for it. And so churches started to be very open to this the earliest written evidence we have is in the 700s, but so they're probably doing it even before that. And then by the time we get into the Middle Ages, the church, the people for birth control started practicing something called oblation. Oblation is where a family would have a baby, they can't afford to care for it, so they bring it to a monastery or a church, and for a small amount of money then, by that time the church was requiring payment. For a small amount of money, then the church would take care of the baby, raise it up for God or the religious order. And then that eventually also became turned into something called foundling hospitals, that churches said, well, we're getting so many babies coming in, let's have a specific ministry that's set up for bring your babies in here. And they just got flooded with babies, foundlings they would call them, whether you leave your baby there or you find the baby somewhere else and you bring it to the foundling hospital where people raise the baby for God. At one point, in the between 1750 and 1800. So this was a very popular method during that time of European culture, European history. And between 1750 and 1800, 40% of French newborns were raised in foundling hospitals. Isn't that wild? You have 100 babies in the city, 40 of them are being dropped off at the foundling hospital. But thank God the foundling hospitals were there. In one year alone, over 40,000 babies were dropped off at the foundling hospitals. That's wild. But you know what? That's way better than let's abort the baby, let's kill the baby, let's abandon the baby in the woods. At least they're giving it to someone that can try to take care of it. So when did modern birth control methods start to be used? The earliest date that historians point to is the late 1600s in France. It started among aristocratic French women that I don't remember what they found. There were certain medicines or combinations of things that would stop or that would work as contraceptives. And so among the aristocratic French women, it started to become popular to start using those in order to limit their family size. And when a sociologist that I read, she looked at the different accounts that the first person primary accounts of the women themselves, why they were doing it. She said it broke down into two main reasons that the women had. Number one was the cost of education at that point started rising a lot, and the families could not afford to educate more kids. And then the other thing was there was, and this is kind of a good thing, the culture started realizing, moms, you should spend time with your kids. You should raise your kids. You shouldn't just birth your kids and you leave them with the nanny. You should actually be a mother. And so then some of these French aristocratic women were like, well, we want to actually raise our kids, but we can't raise 15, so we're going to try to limit the number of kids we have so we have more time with them. So, okay, they've got some positive motives, but good or bad, in the late 1600s, the French women started to use birth control, and then it spread throughout Europe, and now it's all over the world. I think one statistic I read in my research, it said, was it like 65% of women throughout the world are on birth control, one form or another. It's like, that's huge. I was very surprised by that. All right, and in the midst of all this, the Catholic Church took so the early church had a very strong stance against birth control, and then as the church history progressed, you've got the Catholics and the Protestants, so then you have the Orthodox, and the Catholic Church took the strongest stance against birth control. The Protestants, there's a whole spectrum of opinions on it. The Orthodox were very similar to the Catholics, but the Catholics were like really hardcore, birth control is bad. 1588, Pope Sixtus V demanded that we declared that using birth control was the same as murder, and the punishment should be the same as for a murderer. 1930, Pope Pius XI said that using any form of birth control violates the law of God and nature and is stained by a great and mortal flaw. And as recent as 1968, Pope Paul VI issued the Humanae Vitae, which prohibited all forms of birth control other than abstinence and breastfeeding. Because as a woman breastfeeds, then it delays often her ability to conceive. So the Catholic Church has taken a very strong stance of birth control through the years, and the early church, before the Catholic Protestant divide, the early church took a pretty strong stance against birth control. Now, what is my opinion? Now we're finally getting to that, yeah. So, super short version, pretty short version, I guess, is my opinion on birth control it depends on two different things. It depends on the method that you use, and it depends on your motive for using it. There are a lot of different methods of birth control, and I got into an argument a few years back. Somebody was telling me, he said, Billy Graham approved of birth control, and birth control is sin, so Billy Graham is going to hell. And I'm like, okay, that logically is inconsistent. That doesn't work. And then I start saying, well, I don't, and he's like, do you believe birth control is okay? And I'm like, I don't believe all birth control is the same. Some birth control is bad. Some birth control, I don't believe, is sin. And he's like, well, then you're going to hell. And he wouldn't even let me explain it all. There's different methods of birth control. Infanticide, wrong. Abortion, wrong. Anything that kills the baby or the baby in process, which is still a life, that's wrong. Life begins at conception. And if the egg is fertilized, that's a baby. That's forming. I heard an interesting kind of argument on that recently, which I thought that's actually kind of cool. I like that. Said if the guy was saying it, okay, you've got the fertilized egg, and it starts growing, right? It's like, okay, so if it's growing, that means it's alive, right? Okay, so if it's alive, it's a living thing. Okay, and if you were to, what kind of living thing is it? Is it a crocodile? Is it a dog? Is it a plant? Is it an alien? What is it? Well, let's go test the DNA. What kind of DNA does it have? Oh, it has human DNA. So it's a living thing and it has human DNA. It's a living human being. That once the conception starts, that's what it is. It shouldn't be this debate about, well, is it after 40 weeks? Is it after it has a heartbeat? Is it when it can feel pain? No, it's a human being. It's a living human being. So, okay, if you want to abort that living human being, even if it right now doesn't quite look like a living human being, that's murder, and that's not okay. That's my opinion. Any step in the process, any birth control method that you use that kills the baby, whatever that baby looks like, if it's a living human being, that's murder, and it's not okay. But if you, and then there are methods. What about methods that don't do that? That don't stop the life, take the life of the baby that's forming. Are those okay? Well, one thing that you have to consider is there are a lot of side effects to every birth control method out there. I had no idea how many side effects are out there. But if you're considering birth control, or if somebody asks you, what do you think about birth control? Well, that is something to consider, and you can look it up. And every drug out there, every hormone out there, there's a lot of side effects. I saw two interesting studies on that in the past couple of years. One was apparently women on hormonal birth control, their brains are changing, which this is not a big surprise there. Their brains are changing to be more like men's brains, more aggressive, more risk-taking, less fear, less inhibitions. Okay, are you willing to have your brain change in that way? Well, that's one of the risks that some of the birth control has. Another one, they're finding that there's 130% increase. Your chance of depression, struggling with depression, increases 130% for a woman if you're on a hormonal birth control. So there are negative effects, and then there's physical effects of the stuff. So that's something that you have to consider. It's maybe not a moral issue, but it's a real issue. Now, are there methods of birth control that are okay, that don't kill the baby, that don't cause too many negative side effects? I think there are. There's a lot of natural methods like breastfeeding, like abstinence, like you can look at the woman's cycle and time things right to coordinate with that. I don't think there's anything morally wrong necessarily with those things. Surgical procedures, I don't think there's necessarily anything morally wrong with a surgical procedure if you have the right motive. So then that brings it to the second thing. Qualifier is, it depends on your motive. If your motive is that you want to continue being selfish and irresponsible, and that's not okay. If your motive is, well, I just don't think I don't know how to be a good parent. Well, birth control may not be the issue, that the answer. Maybe learn how to be a good parent. And nobody knows how to be a good parent unless, you can learn, but not until you have that baby do you really figure it out. And even when you have the baby, you still feel like you don't know what you're doing. And then you have a new baby, and that's totally different than the first baby. And so, that's just reality. You never have it all figured out. Maybe you want birth control, the early church spoke against it because people wanted to fool around and commit adultery and go to prostitutes. If that's what you're yeah, I like where I can go and hook up with guys every now and then. That's kind of fun. No, that's sin. That's wrong. The answer is not birth control. The answer is you repent and you live right before God. Stop screwing around. So maybe you have a legitimate reason. There are people who, if they get pregnant, it's a physical risk. It could cause death. There's a physical problem in them. So maybe birth control is the answer then. I would say before you jump to birth control, maybe pray for healing. Maybe see if there's a way that you can solve that and still have kids. And we know people that medically it was dangerous for them to have kids, and they prayed, they trusted God, they had kids, and they were fine. So don't just take your doctor's advice and go, well, that's just all there is to it. Well, your doctor may or may not know God. Your doctor may or may not have faith. Your doctor may not understand how the spiritual realm works. So don't just jump to, I can't have kids and that's it. It's too dangerous for me. I can't do it. Birth control. That's all I can do because I don't want to die. Well, there might be other ways around it. But maybe you have a legitimate reason. Maybe there's a physical problem. Maybe you're living in a van down by the river and you're like, I don't know if I have enough seats in my van to have more kids. Maybe you're just that destitute as a couple that like you aren't figuring out your own life and you're working on it. But right now, you're like, we just don't have the finances. We can't make this work. So for a period of time, we're going to have to do some form of birth control. Maybe it's a military family, and the husband is going to be off at war for the next 6 months or a year or whatever it is, and the wife's like, let's wait until you get back, and then we can start family, or the husband says it. There might be some legitimate reasons. I think more often than not, people give reasons that are excuses more than anything. There was a 2022 Harris poll, surveyed 1,000 different adults, 1,000 different women that said they would never have children. And so of them, they asked, why are you not going to have children? And the answer is very interesting. I'll just highlight a few of them. 28% because of climate change. Oh, it's getting hotter. Have you guys noticed? Global warming is really bad right now. It's so hot out there. Side note on the global warming climate change thing. It's so fake. Like, it's all goofy. Like, if you look at, so we have records of global temperatures the modern world has kept more accurate records of temperatures. But you can go back to even medieval times, and there's records of temperatures. I don't know if you're aware of this, but during the medieval time, I think it was 500 to, I'm going to get the dates wrong. But I just read this book about the history of weather, which sounds really dumb, but it was very interesting. I liked it. It was talking about this massive global warming event during the Middle Ages where England's, if you've never been to England, I will describe England in summer. It's dreary, it's cold, it's wet. I mean, it's pretty close to the North Pole. England is not like a sunny, cheery place typically. If it's sunny and cheery when you're there, you got like God's favor on you. Go plant some churches and stuff because you got God on you. During the Middle Ages, the British were talking about how warm it was during this period, how warm it was, how hot it is, how sunny it is, and they had records of like how many sunny days per year and all that. And it sounds beautiful, and it was so hot, so warm, and their climate had shifted so much that they had vineyards and were producing some of Europe's best wine during the Middle Ages. Greenland too. Greenland had vineyards during that period. And have you seen pictures of Greenland? It's not green. Greenland is ice. It's cold. And so weather shifts, and you have patterns. And are we in a warmer shift right now? Well, not this week, no. But maybe we're in a warm shift for now. But guess what? It's going to shift back, and then it'll shift this way again. So don't ever get caught up in that climate hysteria. And any of you guys who are older than 12 can probably point to, you could go back, right now it's climate change. Before this, it was global warming. Before that, it was a hole in the ozone layer. Before that, it was acid rain and the killer bees. And then it's an ice age. And then, just wait 20 years and they're going to be scared about something else. But, all right, 28% of people said, climate change is so bad that I could never have it. I will never birth a kid to be born in a planet that will boil. And okay, fine, don't have your kids. We'll keep having kids and be happy and enjoy the planet without you. 31% said, I won't have kids because of the U.S. political situation. Have you ever traveled outside the U.S.? I'm frustrated about our politics, and I hope you are too, but just go visit any other country for an extended period of time, and you will realize our problems are minor in comparison. If that is keeping you from kids, boy, I don't know. And the last one, though, this was the majority response. The biggest response was 54% of people said, of these women surveyed, said, we will never have children because we want to maintain personal independence. I want to do what I want when I want, and I don't want kids to get in the way. The reality is, most people's motive is selfishness. They want, either you're not married and you want to be able to fool around and do whatever you want and not have evidence that you were fooling around and don't want to have a kid that you got to raise, or you are married, but you look at it and you go, oh, I like being a dink. I like having two incomes, dual incomes, no kids. I like being able to do what I want when I want. I don't want to have to change diapers. Have you seen that stuff? You smelled those things? I don't want to wake up in the middle of the night 3 times to do breastfeeding, 6 times. 3 was minimum. They look at it. I think most people's reason is that they don't want the inconvenience of having kids. The reality is, yeah, kids are hard work. Kids cost money. Kids are difficult. But I would never call my kids an inconvenience, except for you. But I love my kids. You know how much shoveling I had to do this last week? A lot, because my kids can't handle it all. But not as much as I would have had to do if we had no kids. You know how many cookies I ate this last week? A lot, because my kids made cookies for me. If I had no kids, I would not have eaten any cookies, and I wouldn't have any health problems. Fasting is much harder when you have kids that like to cook. I come home and I'm like, what's that smell? Why'd you make fresh bread while I'm fasting? Don't do that. Yeah, kids are a lot of work. Raising a big family, raising one kid is a lot of work. It will radically change your life, but it changes your life for the better. It's awesome. It's a blessing. This is going to be a 3-week series. All right. So the short version of my opinion on birth control is that it depends on the method you use, whether it's sinful or not. It depends on your motives, on why you want it, whether it's sinful or not. But even if the method that you choose is fine, and even if your motive is fine, I personally don't think that the Bible teaches that using birth control and limiting your family size is ultimately God's best heart for you. And it may be permissible. It may be something that, okay, it's not going to send you to hell, but it's not necessarily God's best for you. I think of it like divorce. Divorce is awful. And it's not, you can't make an equal comparison. Divorce is awful. Divorce tears up families. I grew up with in a broken family. My parents got divorced when I was 11 or 12 or something like that. And Jesse and I were never getting a divorce. Neither one of us is ever going to do anything else to the other that would cause us to want to have a divorce, but we're not getting a divorce. It's terrible. God hates divorce, it says in the Bible. It's an awful thing. But there are certain situations where divorce is like, well, that's what you got to do. If there's a husband that is perpetually abusing his wife or something, okay, you got to get away. And maybe you separate, and maybe that's enough. I've known people that have tried a separation, and then the other spouse comes back with, well, if you're going to separate from me, I'm going to get divorced then. Like, okay, well, then what choice do you have? You're being divorced. The Bible says you can walk away at that point. You can be divorced. But is that God's heart? That every marriage would end in divorce? I think the average marriage, well, actually, I don't remember what it was. I think one statistic I saw, I think it was 7 years, but that was a while back. It's probably a lot less than that now. Or it might be higher because fewer people are getting married. They're just hooking up and fooling around. But is that God's heart? Is that what he set out when he made marriage? That he's like, man, I would love it if I could get you two, Adam and Eve, if you could get together, make a couple kids, then get frustrated, get bitter, not talk about it, and get divorced after 5 years, and then go find someone else. And it's going to be hard on the planet. There's just the two of us, but no, that's not what God wants. He doesn't want a bunch of people getting married, getting divorced, find someone else, and get divorced, find someone else, and just connect for a little while and then move on. No, marriage, the intention, God's heart for you, the best that he wants for you is you find a spouse that loves God, you get married, you love God together, you get a bunch of kids, you have an awesome family, and then you get old one day, have a bunch of grandkids, and then everybody's having kids, and you have family reunions filled with 100 people all related to you. They all look alike, all wear glasses and have blonde hair. and have a beautiful big family who all loves Jesus. That's the best. That's God's heart. Now, in that, there are situations where you're not going to get the best. Maybe there's an issue. Maybe there's a problem. Maybe there's a temporary situation where, okay, birth control would be allowed. So I think I'm going to actually, I'm going to just leave it there. Leave it there for today. It's a little bit early, but I don't think I can get into the next topic until next week. So let me leave it off at that. The short answer is I believe that birth control is allowable depending on motive and the method you choose in certain situations, but I don't believe it's necessarily God's best heart for humanity in general, and I don't believe it's necessarily his heart for you. And I think a lot of people use birth control to maintain a selfish lifestyle. Or they use birth control because they're allowing fear and doubt in instead of walking in faith. So next week we're going to go into I want to look at a biblical framework. So the Bible doesn't deal specifically with birth control in a birth control bad, birth control good type sense. But the Bible does show us the heart of God. It shows us his intentions toward humanity. And so I want to look at that, give a framework, a foundational framework of what does the Bible talk about with families and children and all that. And hopefully inspire some of you to either, if you're married and at the place where you're having kids, that you go, yeah, let's have some more kids. Let's do this and let's raise them to love Jesus. Or maybe you're not at that place that you go, you know what? I can't wait to get married and start having kids and fill the earth with little Jesus lovers, image bearers of God. That's my goal. So we'll get into that next week, give a biblical framework for family and kids. And then I think we'll probably I'll finish next week and give a good, strong case for having a big family. All right. Yeah, there we go.